The Galaxy Council paid no attention until humanity said one sentence: "We're coming." 15 alien warships surrounded the melon, and Captain Maria Lau was still smiling. The display showed assault vectors tightening like a net, closing on something that couldn't run. On the main screen, the lead destroyer had printed its hull registry in light codes: Calvarian 5th Fleet Vanguard, standard intimidation, standard everything, except for one detail. The melon was not a military vessel. It was a civilian transport carrying 847 colonists and 12 years of farming equipment. Maria's fingers rested on the fire control toggles anyway. "Stand down your weapons and cut thrust," the alien commander broadcast. His voice came through translation layer distortion, all guttural bass notes that the speakers struggled to render. "You have entered a restricted zone. Your vessel is under seizure authority granted by Folded Chamber 47. Maria didn't recognize the name. That was the point. She hit the internal comms. "Weapons, crew. Bring up the secondary mineral processing array." "Captain," Vaughn's response crackled back. "That's just the mining laser. I know what it is." The Calvarian Vanguard shifted its angle, bringing new weapon arrays online. Lights strobed across the darkness, targeting solutions, painting the melon's hull. 17 seconds until they fired. Maria counted each one by the hammering of her own pulse. The mining laser wasn't built to tear through warship armor. It was built to slice through ice-core asteroids and vaporize volatile minerals without contaminating the ore. It was crude, inefficient by military standards, redundant, 3 overlapping thermal grids that kept firing even if one grid overloaded. The kind of tool a species builds when it spent 8,000 years killing itself, when survival means backups for your backups. "Full thermal lance," Maria said. "Overload the grids. I don't care about the cost." The melon's industrial bays lit up like a star being born. The thermal beam didn't come out clean and focus the way a military weapon would. It came out in a thick, blinding column of raw force. It was the kind of thing designed to punch through rock, not through shields engineered for predictable physics. The Calvarian Vanguard's shields collapsed in 8 seconds. Its hull cracked like dry ceramic, venting atmosphere in frozen crystal clouds. The destroyer started rotating, dead weight spinning against its own inertia. "Second Vanguard is breaking formation," Vaughn reported, but the others weren't attacking. They were moving, falling back, recalculating. The melon's bridge crew watched the tactical display shift, warship markers sliding away like they'd just realized they were not holding the weapon they thought they were holding. Maria leaned back in her chair. The light from the cooling laser array reflected off the view screen, casting her in burnt orange. She was still smiling. "We're coming," she transmitted into the open channel, broadcasting toward the coordinates where the council station would be listening. "Ready or not. If you think an empire built on silence had any idea what happens when we speak, you'll want to hear how this ends. Because 3 days earlier, on the other side of that barrier, someone was about to stop listening to anything but the sound of their own fear. 3 days earlier, Dr. Sarah Chen was staring at numbers that shouldn't exist. The Pan-Solar Observatory's terminal showed outbound transmission vectors across 93 sectors of known space. Each one was a thread of data meant to announce humanity's presence to a listening galaxy. Each one terminated at precisely 121.4 astronomical units from the sun's core, then stopped. Not faded, not degraded by distance. Stopped, like hitting an invisible wall. Hardware failure. Admiral Marcus Webb stood in the shadows beyond the thermal array glow. "No." Sarah's fingers drummed against her old silver chronometer, a mechanical piece she'd inherited from her grandfather, the kind that ticked with actual gears and springs instead of digital timekeeping. She tapped it 3 times, a habit when recalculating. "The Chile array is responding clean. The Proxima relay is clean. The signal reaches the boundary and doesn't scatter, doesn't fade. It just stops." The chronometer clicked, mechanical, inevitable. "The math doesn't lie, Marcus. The universe isn't empty. It's just keeping time against us." Webb leaned closer to the display. The rendering showed Sol at the center, a blue marble with humanity's transmission sphere reaching outward like pale fingers. That invisible boundary sat beyond all of it, a perfect mathematical shell at the edge of everything they'd ever tried to reach. "How long have the transmissions been terminating?" Webb asked. "Since we started building them." since before we launched the first deep space probe. 200 years. 200 years of shouting into the dark, and someone's been holding the door shut. Webb's jaw tightened. He scrolled through the data, his military bearing rigid. You're saying it's not natural. Nothing about this is natural. A solar system-wide transmission barrier doesn't form by accident. It doesn't persist for 2 centuries without active maintenance, and it doesn't have a 30-meter dead zone tolerance that lets our short-range broadcasts through, but cuts everything past 121.4 AU down to 0. Sarah pulled up a subsection. Someone built this. Someone is running it, and someone doesn't want us talking to anyone on the other side. The observational deck fell silent. Around them, the automated systems hummed, array motors tracking invisible points in the sky, processors sorting through petabytes of archived transmissions, all of it reaching toward a void that reached back with absolute refusal. We need to take this to the assembly, Webb said finally. They won't believe it without proof. Then we get proof. Webb turned from the screen. How long until you can map the entire perimeter? Sarah looked at her chronometer. The second hand swept in its mechanical arc. 48 hours. Less if I shut down the Mars relay and redirect processing power. But Marcus, if this is real, if something's actually containing our entire system. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Webb's expression hardened. Then we find out why, and we find out how to break it. The chronometer ticked. Click, click, click. Behind the data, behind the mathematics, something vast was holding its breath, and it was about to stop. The United Earth Assembly convened in the Orbital Council chamber above New Vancouver, and Sarah Chen brought the weight of silence with her. The chamber's architecture was designed to impress, curved observation rails overlooking a central floor, each of Earth's 7 continental divisions represented by a seat. Sarah stood at the center, her chronometer visible on her wrist, ticking audibly in the quiet before she spoke. The transmission boundary is artificial, she said. No preamble, no softening. Maintained. Active. Built to appear natural through mathematical degradation patterns, but the degradation is uniform, intentional. Someone didn't want us to notice. The assembly shifted. Questions overlapped, from the African seat, the Asian seat, the Americas. The noise was immediate and defensive. Sarah waited for it to collapse. For 200 years, we've broadcast outbound signals to a listening galaxy that couldn't hear us. Every probe, every commercial transmission, every message home from deep space colonies, all of it cut off at exactly 121.4 astronomical units. She pulled up the data visualization. The sphere. The perfect, impossible sphere. This isn't a solar wind effect. This isn't radiation degradation. This is a wall, and someone's maintaining it. Representative Chen Hui from the Pacific Division leaned forward. You're saying we're quarantined. I'm saying we've been quarantined for a long time. And I'm saying whoever built this doesn't want us talking to the galaxy beyond it. The chamber erupted. Some voices demanded proof. Some demanded action. Some demanded to know why the government hadn't detected this already. Webb stood silent at the chamber's edge, his uniform absorbing the chaos without flinching. Sarah raised her voice. I have 48 hours of data validation. Peer review will take another week. But the mathematics don't lie. You can debate the interpretation later. Right now, you need to decide. Do we accept the quarantine or do we break it? The question hung. Somewhere in the silence, someone was calculating the cost of acceptance against the cost of defiance. Representative Arkafa from the African seat spoke first. What would breaking it require? The Archimedes array, Sarah said. All 64 thermal collectors, synchronized and overloaded, focused at one point on the boundary. The barrier has a heat dissipation threshold. I calculated it from the signal termination patterns. If we exceed that threshold in a narrow band, it fractures. Not everywhere, just at the point of focus. How long would that take? Arkafa asked. 12 minutes to synchronization, 3 minutes to charge, 3 minutes to fire. And after, this from Representative Torres of the Americas Division. After we transmit, we tell the galaxy we're here. We tell them we're not asking permission. The chamber went still. In that stillness, Sarah could feel the weight of 200 years pressing down, 200 years of isolation, 200 years of silence treated as the natural state of the world. Hui spoke again. And if they respond militarily? Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Everyone in the chamber understood what it meant to break a quarantine that had held for 2 centuries. Everyone understood that the civilization maintaining that quarantine had done so for a reason. The vote came at midnight, 43 in favor, 42 opposed, a majority so thin it felt like balance beam mathematics. One person's absence would have changed everything. In folded chamber 47, 14 light years distant, and folded through dimensions that linear physics couldn't describe. High Counselor Varith received the first alert at the moment the Archimedes array began its synchronization. The chamber itself was a work of bureaucratic grandeur, a space large enough to hold the representatives of 7,000 registered civilizations, though today only the council core was present. Varith occupied the primary dais, his 4 asymmetric limbs arranged across its surface in the posture of absolute authority. His skin shimmered like oil on water, amber fading to crimson in the light of the chamber's output screens. Unusual activity detected in the Sol system, one of his subordinates reported, a Marian with oversized ocular lenses that reflected the data streams like mirrors. The thermal collectors, all 64 of the Archimedes array, are showing synchronization patterns, synchronized heating, sequential energy transfer. This appears to be a deliberate configuration. Varith's dermal patterns shifted to yellow, curiosity, dismissal. They're conducting a scientific experiment. They do this periodically. Log it and continue monitoring. Counselor, researcher Velshara stepped forward from the archives sector, a Marian archivist with scars across her neck from ancient wars her people no longer fought. The power output is exceeding scientific norms. This is approaching 847 terawatts, focused, directional. And the focus point is, she paused, scrolling through her data. The focus point is the containment barrier itself. The chamber's ambient hum changed frequency. Varith's color deepened to crimson. That's not possible, he said. The barrier is a mathematical certainty. They don't have the technological framework to even conceive of its structure. They're conceiving of it now, Velshara said. Her voice was steady, but her scarred neck showed the rapid pulse of actual fear. And they're weaponizing it. The first breach came at 14:47 station time. The barrier, maintained by the Calvarian Empire's most sophisticated defensive grid technology, fractured under a thermal load it had never been engineered to withstand. Not because the technology was crude. It wasn't. It fractured because the humans had built their weapon with redundancy instead of elegance. 3 overlapping systems instead of one perfect system. A species that had survived by assuming everything breaks. The barrier didn't fall completely. It fractured in a narrow band, a tunnel of open space barely 2 kilometers wide. But in that gap, a signal emerged, 5 words, transmitted directly into the open channel where every monitoring station in the galaxy could hear it. We're coming, ready or not. Varith's skin cycled through colors that Velshara had never seen him produce before. Yellow to crimson to something that hovered between panic and rage, a shade that had no name in the Calvarian emotional lexicon because the Calvarian Empire had never learned to feel it. How long have they had this capability? He demanded. Velshara pulled up the historical records. 240 years of archived Earth transmissions. 240 years of a species that had not been allowed to speak beyond its quarantine, but had been very, very busy speaking to itself. Nuclear fusion at 240 years post-threshold. FTL propulsion at 180. Weapons systems that weaponized infrastructure instead of building specialized arms. A species that built backups for their backups because survival meant assuming your primary system would fail. They've been developing this since before the quarantine was established, Velshara said. They didn't build the weapon for the barrier. They built the weapon as a survival mechanism, and then they realized they could use it against the barrier. Varith's voice dropped to the resonant chest vibrations that served him as speech. Send the 5th Fleet, full deployment. Cut off their colony ships. Force them back behind the boundary. If they advance further, destroy them. Counselor, that would constitute an act of unprovoked aggression against a developing civilization. They just broke a 200-year-old containment protocol, Varith said. His color settled into a steady crimson. They are no longer developing. They are now a threat. In the folded chamber, in the halls where law and order were supposed to be abstract and unquestionable, something shifted. The ancient system of isolation had just met something it was not prepared for, a species that had spent 10,000 years learning to kill each other, and now had nothing left to lose by killing something else. The signal continued, transmitting into the dark. "We're coming, ready or not." Velshara watched the ripples spread through the galactic network. In the archives, in the records she kept with obsessive care, this was the moment. The moment when human civilization stopped asking for permission and started asking for war. She thought of their 200-year silence. She thought of their weapons built from mining equipment. She thought of their species that could not be subdued because subduing it would require a single point of failure, and they'd learned millennia ago that single points of failure were suicidal. On her data screens, the Fifth Fleet broke orbit and began their approach vector toward humanity's first colony ship. The barrier's breach was still open, still transmitting, still saying the same 5 words into a galaxy that was finally, terrifyingly, beginning to listen. The Fifth Fleet dropped from FTL space 15,000 kilometers from the Melon's position, and every weapons system activated simultaneously. 15 warships, not the Vanguard anymore, the heavy strike force. The Calvarian Fifth came with destroyer-class vessels rated for taking down planetary defense grids, with coordinated targeting systems built on the assumption that any opponent would fold under synchronized pressure. They hadn't been designed to fight something that was willing to lose. On the Melon's bridge, alarms sang. Maria watched the tactical display redraw itself, showing the fleet forming an intercept sphere. Standard encirclement, standard everything. "All hands to battle stations," she said into the comms. Her voice was steady. "Shut down the agricultural sections, reroute life support to the engines and the mining array. We're not outrunning them, we're outfighting them." The bridge crew moved. No hesitation, no questions. A species that had spent 10,000 years killing itself had learned what military culture meant at a genetic level. When the order came, you moved or you died. The Melon's engine signature began to shift, heat output climbing, as the ship's power systems recalibrated from colonization mode to combat mode. The first volley came at 14:32 station time, a synchronized pulse of high-energy weapons fire, the kind designed to pierce reinforced starship hulls. The Melon's point defense grid caught most of it. The shield generators held, but the ship lurched, and somewhere in the secondary sections, something critical ruptured. Vaughn's voice came through damage control. "Breach in cargo bay 7. Automatic bulkheads sealed. We're venting atmosphere but holding pressure in adjacent sections." Maria didn't acknowledge. She was watching the fleet reposition, their ships moving with eerie coordination, the mathematics of predator logic applied to warfare. A single unified strategy, a single point of failure. "Charge the primary mining array," she said. Second Vanguard, entering optimal firing range in 43 seconds. The ship's industrial sections roared to life. The Melon wasn't a warship, but it had been built in the age when humanity had learned to weaponize everything. The mining laser array came online, not elegant, not refined, but redundant. 3 overlapping systems, 3 separate thermal conduits. If one failed, 2 others kept firing. The second Vanguard died the same way the first one had. Shield collapse at 8 seconds, hull fracture at 12, atmosphere venting in crystalline clouds. The destroyer fell out of formation, and suddenly the Calvarian fleet's perfect coordination had a gap in it. But gaps closed. The remaining ships tightened their sphere. Heavier weapons charged. A Calvarian cruiser, larger, more sophisticated, began its targeting sequence, weapons arrays rotating to engage the Melon's core section. "They're adapting," Vaughn said. The urgency in his voice had sharpened. The cruisers shifting to modulated fire, rapid alternating frequencies. "Our point defense grid can't cycle fast enough to match." The first volley from the cruiser hit, and the Melon's shields flickered. Held. Almost failed. Held again. The ship's entire frame groaned, metal stress fractures spreading through the hull's tertiary supports. Maria's jaw tightened. She'd known this moment would come. She'd known that destroying the first Vanguard would teach the fleet to be afraid, and fear made systems more dangerous, not less. Fear made them desperate. Desperate made them creative. "Dump the thermal reserves," she ordered. All of them. One massive discharge toward the cruiser's shield generators. "Captain, that's—" "I know what it is." "Do it." The melon's entire energy output vented into a single, massive column of thermal force. It wasn't a precise weapon anymore. It was a death scream. It wasn't beautiful. It was functionally equivalent to throwing a star at them. The Calvarian cruiser's shields collapsed in a cascade failure. The thermal discharge, too much for any single system to handle, burned through redundancy after redundancy, not because Calvarian engineering was weak, but because Calvarian engineering was built on the assumption that systems wouldn't be pushed past design tolerances. The cruiser's engines shut down automatically as the thermals overloaded the control matrices. 3 ships down, 12 remaining. But then, from a vector no one had been monitoring, a new signature appeared. A Threne dreadnought, its hull scarred from wars that happened centuries ago, emerged from the stellar dust and positioned itself between the Melon and the remaining Calvarian fleet. On the Melon's bridge, the tactical display froze. "That's," Vaughn began. "Threne Protectorate," Maria finished. She knew the profile. Every human military academy studied the Threne, reformed warmongers, ancient fighters. The civilization that had decided war was obsolete and then had backed that decision with enough firepower to make it stick. A transmission came through, voice modulated but clear. "I am Commander Th. of the Threne Protectorate. Stand down your weapons immediately. This blockade is unauthorized by the Council's founding protocols. You are engaging a developing civilization without formal provocation. Cease immediately, or my forces will intervene." The Calvarian fleet's formation wavered. For the first time, the perfect mathematical coordination broke. In folded chamber 47, Varith's colors cycled to a deep, dangerous crimson. "The Threne are not permitted to intervene," he said to his assembled commanders. "They are peacekeepers, not combatants. This is council business." Velshara spoke from the archives, her scarred voice steady. "Commander Th. is citing the founding accords, the section that prohibits armed action against non-hostile developing civilizations without formal council vote. The humans haven't fired on anyone beyond their own containment zone. Technically, the blockade is in violation." "Technically," Varith leaned forward. "Is that what you're calling the breach of a 200-year quarantine?" "Yes," Velshara said, "because what matters now is not what the humans did. What matters is what we do next. We can either fight the Threne as well as the humans, or we can accept that this confrontation has become politically untenable." The Calvarian fleet's withdrawal began at 14:51 station time. Not a retreat. Varith's honor wouldn't permit calling it that, but a tactical repositioning, a strategic recalibration. 12 warships falling back from a civilian transport that had just destroyed 3 of their number using nothing but industrial equipment and the kind of thinking only a species forged in constant survival could produce. Commander Th.'s dreadnought held position, a scarred barrier between humanity's first deep space colony and the empire that had tried to cage them. On the Melon's bridge, Maria Lau sat in her command chair and allowed herself a single breath. The tactical display showed the Calvarian fleet moving to a holding position 3 light minutes distant, within weapons range, but not advancing, not attacking, not winning. "Engineering, what's our damage assessment?" Maria asked. 7 breaches sealed. 40% of our primary systems are offline. But Captain, the mining array is still operational. 3 of the thermal grids survived, and our kinetic stockpiles are at 87% capacity. Maria nodded. The Melon wasn't done. The Melon wasn't even tired. A species that had learned to fight could always find a way to keep fighting. She opened a channel to the Threne dreadnought. "This is Captain Maria Lau of the civilian colony ship Melon. Thank you for the intervention. We're prepared to continue toward our destination vector if the Council has no further objections." Th.'s response came almost immediately. "The Council's objections are irrelevant. Humanity is no longer a developing civilization. You are a contact entity. That distinction changes everything." The implications settled like gravity. Maria understood. The folded chamber had just lost the legal framework it had used to justify 200 years of quarantine. A species that had fought its way out of a cage was no longer something you could put back inside it. The barrier's breach remained open, still transmitting those 5 words into every frequency the galaxy could hear. "We're coming, ready or not." And now, finally, the galaxy had to listen. The council's invitation arrived 6 hours after THN's dreadnought took position. Not a demand, not a warning, an invitation, formal and careful, the kind of language bureaucracies used when they were no longer sure they held all the power. The message came across every open channel. Humanity was requested to send representatives to Folded Chamber 47 for a formal recognition session. The ancient isolation protocol was being suspended pending review. Sarah Chen read the message twice, then set it aside and pulled up the Archimedes array's power readings. The collectors were cooling now, their massive thermal load dissipating back into the solar wind. 47 terawatts of directed energy had punched a hole in a 200-year-old wall, and now the bureaucrats wanted to talk about it. She tapped her chronometer 3 times, a habit, a counting down, a moment to recalculate. "You're going," Webb said from the communications console. "Not a question. I'm the one who found it. I'm the one who calculated the breach parameters. Yes, I'm going. They might try to negotiate you back into the cage, Sarah. Let them try." She held up her wrist, the chronometer catching the terminal light. The mechanical sweep hand moved in its ancient, unstoppable arc. "We're not negotiating about terms. We're negotiating about reality. The wall is broken. They'll have to learn to live with that." Webb nodded slowly. He understood. The fundamental mathematics had shifted. You could rebuild a wall, but you couldn't unknow that someone had broken it. You couldn't unmake the proof that a civilization you dismissed as developing could weaponize an industrial base into a military force in a matter of hours. Sarah stood. "Prepare the delegation. Keep it small. Me, you, 2 representatives from the assembly, and get me a formal uniform. If I'm standing in front of the galaxy's highest authority, they're going to see exactly what a species that spent 10,000 years surviving looks like." The transition into Folded Chamber 47 was not what Sarah had expected. She prepared for a hostile environment. She prepared for dismissal. She prepared for bureaucratic resistance dressed up in polite language. What she wasn't prepared for was the Marian attendant, a being with oversized ocular lenses and scars across her neck, checking the delegation's credentials and nodding with what looked like grim recognition. "Dr. Chen," the Marian said. Her name tag read, "Velshara, Chief Archivist. I've reviewed your calculations. The breach parameters are mathematically sound. You understand what you've set in motion?" "Yes, I understand that people shouldn't be caged," Sarah said. "No." Velshara's large eyes reflected the chamber light. "I mean you understand that you've broken the only framework that was keeping the galaxy stable. 17 civilizations are now re-evaluating their own border protocols. 4 are actively relocating colonial populations. 2 are demanding council explanations for why they weren't told about human capability assessments." Sarah met that gaze. "Good." The massive doors of Folded Chamber 47 opened. The chamber itself was something that linear geometry barely comprehended. The walls curved in directions that hurt to look at for too long. The dais where High Counselor Varith stood was elevated on what should have been impassable angles, and the assembled council representatives filled what looked like tiers but felt more like a 3-dimensional chessboard. Thousands of observers, thousands of witnesses, the entire political core of the galaxy watching to see what happened when a quarantine broke. Varith's skin was a deep, unsettled purple, a color that signaled distress in Calvarian dermal patterns. His 4 asymmetric limbs gripped the dais surface as he watched Sarah Chen step into the center of the chamber. Commander THN stood at the back of the assembly, a scarred sentinel. Velshara took her place among the archivists. "Dr. Sarah Chen of the Sol System," Varith said, and even through the translation layer distortion, his voice carried all the weight of authority being forced to acknowledge an inferior it had just learned wasn't inferior. "You come before this council." "I come before this council as the representative of a contact civilization," Sarah interrupted. "Not a developing one, not a quarantined one. A contact civilization, that's the distinction now." The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped, some in anger, some in shock, some in what sounded like reluctant respect. Sarah stood in the center and waited for the noise to subside. She had learned long ago that silence was its own weapon. Let the bureaucrats fill it with their panic. Varith's colors shifted, crimson, amber, a sickly orange. "You broke a protocol, established to protect you. You broke a protocol 200 years ago, Sarah said. You decided that keeping us isolated was protection. You didn't ask us. You didn't inform us. You just turned off our ability to speak to the galaxy. So we found another way to speak. We sent one message into the darkness, and now the darkness has to listen. She pulled out her chronometer. The mechanical sweep hand moved in its relentless arc. Click, click, click. The sound carried through the chamber's amplification systems, a simple, human sound in the presence of beings who measured time in quantum pulses and mathematical abstractions. We didn't request a seat at your table. We built the ships to cross the void anyway. We didn't ask for your recognition. We forced it. And we did it because a species that spent 10,000 years killing itself has learned something your empires never will: how to survive when everything breaks. The triad came next, and it landed like the three-beat hammer the DNA had promised. Your quarantine didn't preserve our peace. It simply made us very, very efficient. We weren't trapped in your cage. We were sharpened in it. The chamber fell silent. In that silence, the weight of those 3 sentences did their work. Your quarantine, it simply made we were sharpened. 3 parallel beats, 3 different grammatical starts converging on the same brutal truth. Varith's colors cycled to something that looked like defeat. What do you want, Dr. Chen? What we've always wanted, Sarah said. To exist without permission. To build without asking. To speak into the dark and have the dark answer back. She raised her chronometer. Let them check their clocks. We aren't waiting for your permission to exist. The post-climax moment came in the shifting of the council's gaze. Nen's dreadnought was now legitimate. Velshara's archival warning that she'd been recording this entire time was now historical documentation, not institutional caution. The balance had tilted. The galactic hierarchy had developed a flaw it would spend decades trying to repair. And in the spaces between those realizations, something else began: political calculation, future wars, alliance building, the machinery of galactic conflict recalibrating itself to account for a new variable it hadn't been designed to handle. The delegation departed folded Chamber 47 through the same doors that had admitted them, but the universe they walked back into was fundamentally different. Sarah stood in the transition chamber looking at her chronometer. The second hand ticked in its mechanical rhythm, not counting down anymore, not marking time until something external allowed them to exist, just ticking, present tense, ongoing. The kind of time you build toward, not the kind you wait through. Webb appeared at her side. What happens now? Now we go home. We tell the Assembly that the Council's objections are no longer relevant. We tell every human colony ship in the solar system that the door is open, and we stop asking permission for things we've already decided to do. The chronometer ticked. Sarah tucked it back into her uniform pocket. Around them, the chamber's architecture curved in its impossible geometries. Somewhere in the depths of folded Chamber 47, Varith was standing at his dais, watching the colors shift across his skin, a palette of frustration and the slow comprehension that empires built on predictable mathematics had just met something that learned to survive through improvisation. On the Melon, Captain Maria Lau received the news on her bridge. The Council had formally recognized humanity as a contact civilization. The quarantine was dissolved. The isolation protocols were suspended pending formal renegotiation, a euphemism for "we don't know what to do now." She turned to her bridge crew. Stand down weapons, but keep the mining array operational. I want every ship in the human fleet to know we're ready if they're not. The barrier's breach remained open, still transmitting, still saying those 5 words into a galaxy that had finally, and too late to prevent, learned to listen. We're coming, ready or not. But now the galaxy understood what was really coming. Not just humans, not just a species breaking free from isolation. The fracture of an empire built on the assumption that submission was the only possible response. The moment when linear predictability met something that had learned redundancy at the genetic level. The day when a cage designed to contain silence broke open, and what came pouring out was not the silence anymore. It was the sound of countless human voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing. We're done waiting. Sarah Chen's chronometer ticked in the darkness of the transition chamber. Click, click, click. The sound of time moving forward. The sound of a civilization that had stopped asking permission and started building its own future. Behind her, the doors to folded chamber 47, sealed with a sound like a held breath, finally released.